Hiya. In this video, I'm going to present my findings into my research into video mapping, as well as my processes and eventual results. So, what is projection mapping? Projection mapping, otherwise known as video mapping, light mapping, or occasionally even augmented reality, is a form of projection technology where real-world objects are turned into display surfaces for video projection. So, in its most simple form, it's your standard rectangle onto a wall, so similar to in the classroom or the lecture hall. But more complexly, it can be used on organic shapes, architecture, and moving objects. A valid question is, why am I interested in video mapping? I mean, why should you even use it? People have asked me why I've taken this particular and specific interest in video mapping, when what you will be projecting from Maya or Photoshop is technically already finished. It's done. Move on to your next piece, they say. But I, as well as many other artists, agree that video mapping lends a certain quality, if you will, to the finished piece. It enhances your piece. It can make the already beautiful more beautiful, and it allows for optical illusions of depth, as well as lending itself to the creation of the fantastical and surreal, a live action sort of magic realism, if you will. It also plays with the concept that film is just a rectangle on the wall, and it's awfully cool. So I started my research by investigating what other artists created prior to me, several pieces of which I've already been displaying to you. I then went and ferreted out some literature written on the subject, and whilst I found plenty on the history of video mapping, as well as the effect on target audiences and the popularity with advertisers, I found specifics about the mechanics of creating work for projection limited, and therefore a lot of my conclusions are self-discovered. This limitation required me to create small samples of video mapping rather than one finished piece. So, firstly, I decided to go with projection in its most simple form, a basic illusion of depth achieved by projecting a flat rectangle onto the wall. Inspired by the stylized graphics of this video by deadmau5, I modelled a skull in ZBrush and Maya and textured it in Photoshop. To create the illusion of depth from the digital camera that the box recedes, I had to shrink the back face of the box, as you can see here. Originally, the piece was very flat, as you can see in this render. The skull has no lighting information, and the wall is also very dark. Black is the absence of light, and therefore will not be projected, or at least will be very dim. So I added lighting on both the background and skull, and a much more interesting piece was created. This piece seems like it has depth. I retained the flat stylized look by using AO shaders on the skull, and using light linking, only having one of the lights effective. This piece worked well, I thought, when projected. The illusion of depth within the wall was created, although it would have been more convincing had I been able to consume all of the wall. Unfortunately, this is a limitation of the projector. The scan lines you see here are a result of the differing frame rates of the projector and the camera, and are again, unfortunately, not able to be changed. For my second sample, I wanted to try projection onto a non-flat object, a relief projection. Here, inspired by the video scintillation and the idea of enhancing something, it struck me to enhance a fox skull that I own by projecting life back upon it. Rather than model a fox, of which it would only be the texture that would be projected, as geometry is already there in real life, I did an illustration in Photoshop, which I then hollowed out to match my skull. I had the idea to use eggs as proxies for eyes, so within Maya I procedurally created a pair of eyes using a ramp and a noise shader. As you can see in rigging them, I have misplaced the pivot, and so the rotation is unnatural. I went through another version of eyes before settling on a hand-painted pair which matched my illustration, and correcting the rigging. I created two digital mock-ups, as you can see here, of the final piece before projecting. The projection was entirely unsuccessful, as you can see. I did not take into account how small the fox skull is. It's about the length of my hand, which is probably about just under a foot, maybe, I don't know. And so from a distance, only 100 pixels or so of the projection are covering the skull, not nearly enough to get any sort of clarity. In a close quarters setup, the projection is unfocused. The projector I'm using is simply not designed for this distance. I was very disheartened by this result, but it helped inform my next sample, where I evidently had to go big or go home. In my final sample, I wanted to have another try at enhancing the quality of something. Here, I chose to use a person as my model. Many people commented that the effect of the fox was unsettling or creepy, so in the same vein I wanted to enhance the person to become unsettling. I took a photo of my would-be model, and then using it as a base, painted over her using sick, bruised pastel colours and erasing and enhancing features of the face. This forms a mask. In tandem, I also wanted to create a pair of tights for her. I was very unsure of how to approach this. I knew I wanted the tights to shift and animate, but doing so by hand would prove to be very time inefficient. I first experimented with flat planes and Maya deformers, but these results were ultimately too smooth and pretty. It occurred to me to use Encloth. I did a quick motion test and was pleased with the results. To create a more jagged and random look, I used an irregularly generated mesh. I obtained this mesh via use of an open source program called DMesh, which auto-triangulates images for you and has the potential to export them as OBJs. This is how I also generated the texture, which I then applied to the mesh. Afterwards, it was a case of using spheres and prisms as passive colliders while playing with settings until I got a look I was pleased with. The image of the face was extremely difficult to line up with my real model's face. Here you can see me in the process of attempting to match it. I'm also limited in showing you the results somewhat, as the projection is most successful from the direct front, where the projector is, but of course my camera and tripod would be in the way of the light then. I did achieve genuinely scary and spooky results though, as you can see from these photos. It's unfortunate that the colours became somewhat washed out, and in the future I could learn to account for this by oversaturating my media. The tights I feel are very successful. They have an ooh and ah look to them, as well as an unsettling and a natural quality of motion to them, which looks surreal projected onto a pair of legs. It is a shame that the projection overflows from her legs onto her shoes, the floor and the wall, but this is a limitation of the free source video mapping software I'm using, Facade Signage. Having never attempted video mapping and approaching it very blindly, I am pleased with several of my outcomes. There is of course room for improvement, but these samples have informed me and will be extremely informative to my future undertakings with projection mapping. I must create work specific to the generous projection that is available to me, now that I understand its limitations concerning size and colour. Another limitation I must adhere to now that I realise it exists is my inability to map to organic objects with my current software. Making the most of planar objects would be essential in future endeavours. Overall, this project has been an extremely valuable learning experience from which I have gained a wealth of experience and information. I have attempted and learned new aspects of modelling, animation, rigging, texturing, lighting, rendering, dynamics, simulation, camera work and video mapping. I look forward to using video mapping in the future and making full use of the medium. With its ability to perform optical illusions, create surreal experiences for the audience and enhance the already existing.